Hello, welcome back to the Scouted Football Podcast with me, Joe Donoghue. The Premier League got underway last week, kicking off the 2021-22 campaign in excellent and entertaining fashion. Lots of goals, more talking points, new kits, players, managers, and most importantly, capacity stadiums up and down the country. If you were fortunate enough to be at one of those grounds, I imagine it was probably an amazing experience. It must have been, especially if you hadn't been to one of the matches towards the end of last season, which permitted a limited amount of fans. But this week's guest was at Stamford Bridge, no less, to witness the beginning of the Patrick Vieira era at Crystal Palace, which, now that I say it out loud, has quite a nice ring to it. Matt Woosnam of The Athletic is with us to talk through the changing of the guard at Selhurst Park, which has seen something of an under-23 overhaul, changes in coaching staff, both at senior and under-23 level, as well as some really exciting young player additions. It promises to be quite an intriguing campaign for the Eagles, breaking new ground under a new coach and a first foreign manager in the club's history, I believe. But first off, though, Matt, thanks for joining me today. How are things?
Thanks, Joe. Pleasure to be on. It was really interesting to be at Stamford Bridge for the start of the Patrick Vieira era. It's not the first foreign manager in the club's history. That was the first permanent foreign manager, I believe, would have been Frank de Boer. But the less said about that, the better. That didn't go particularly well, despite the fact that some people have been already talking about that as a possibility, as comparing that to Patrick Vieira. I don't think we're anywhere near that in terms of being able to compare the two, their light and day difference. You did have Attilio Lombardo, I think it was 97-98 season. He was joint manager, I think it was Thomas Brolin. So a blast from the past there. But yeah, back to current times. Obviously, a disappointing defeat at Stamford Bridge at Chelsea for Palace and Vieira's opening day. But I think, considering it was a 4-0 defeat in the fixture last season under Roy Hodgson, you could argue in a way that there was progress. But I think it's one that you can just chalk off as the opening day of the season. Only one of the new signings started. Joachim Andersen came on. That was Marc Guéhi, who obviously I'm sure we'll talk about later. Joachim Andersen came on off the bench and looked good. But Conor Gallagher was ineligible, and then injuries to Michael Olise, Ebere Eze and Nathan Ferguson. So that was obviously a bit disappointing. The performance was poor, I've got to admit. I don't think there's any getting away from that, but I don't think you can take a lot out of it. In terms of the performance and the result, I don't think there's a lot to read into that at this stage.
Yeah, and I tell you what, I promise to everybody listening that the research done on this podcast is a little bit more extensive than my knowledge of previous Palace managers. As soon as you rattled them off, I just went, what an idiot. I can't believe I've done that. Yeah, but yeah, literally the Frank de Boer era, which was, I think era would probably be quite a stretch to say, given how many games he managed. And of course, Attilio Lombardo, that was, that is a blast from the past and a half. But yeah, I think, to be honest, most people probably wouldn't have had Crystal Palace in their accumulator at the weekend to go to Stamford Bridge and essentially with a few. While there were just the one new signing in the team. Obviously, there's been a summer of change, whereas you've kind of got gentle evolution at Chelsea. I think it's fair to say, and obviously the wealth disparity is one which always rears its head, especially in those early games of the season. But maybe some progress in a very small way by conceding one goal fewer than last season. But yourself, you work for The Athletic, obviously covering Crystal Palace, and I suppose based on your knowledge of Palace managers compared to mine, you've obviously got a great deal more experience covering the club over the past few years. How long is it that you've been covering Palace in any capacity?
Yeah, so I've been at The Athletic for 2 years. So before that, I was I was doing it. I was covering Palace sort of off part-time freelance mostly for the South London Press, just sort of writing match reports and transfer bits here and there. But I've run the Palace Youth Twitter account since about 2014. So yeah, I've always kind of been interested in the academy and the young players coming through. Aaron Wan-Bissaka obviously stands out in the mind. I always remember how good he was as a defensive winger. I would never ever have said he'll be a right back. I'm not going to start claiming that. But he was always had something about him as a defensive winger, coming and tracking back and making those tackles that he's so well known for as a right back these days. But yeah, so I think pretty much sort of for the last sort of 7 years, I've kind of started writing about Palace. I was the online editor of the FYP fanzine for a few years and contributed to their physical print magazine as well as doing the online stuff. So yeah, I've been in and around for quite a long time. I'm a Palace fan as well, as most people would have probably deduced from that. I went with my dad when I was a kid. It's been passed down from the generations. So yeah, been a while of covering Palace, even in some kind of capacity.
I suppose it always helps when you're a fan of a club, but you'll have that connection, you'll have that background knowledge, you'll know all of the weird and wonderful anecdotes of players getting caught up at Christmas parties and whatnot, and all that sort of thing. But I think this season, with it being the Hodgson leaving, and then was it 12 senior players? I mean, I had a count, and there was probably about 8 actual first teamers that I would see on Match of the Day quite regularly, who left in the summer, which I think is, while it's not quite an exodus, it is quite it's a fair amount of first team players to replace or to compensate for leaving in one summer. And then you factor in the fact that the manager has also changed, and obviously coaching staff, and there's been changes at under 23 level as well. And it seems as though that there's been quite a transition.
Definitely. I think it's at the moment they've got about a net loss of 5 players. They let 10 go. I don't think they necessarily would have sort of actively chosen to let, say, Andros Townsend go. I think in an ideal world they probably would have kept him. I think that experience, I personally would have kept him as well. I don't think he necessarily made a huge impact on the pitch, but I think certainly if you're transitioning to a younger squad, then there are a few better players, or rather people, to have around the club than Andros Townsend, who's been there and experienced a lot, made mistakes. I interviewed him last summer. It all blurs into one. I think it was last summer, and we talked about the managers who shaped his career, and he talked about the mistakes he made under Pochettino as a younger player at Spurs, and I think that I would personally have kept him, but yeah, it's been a massive transition this summer, and it's really interesting. I think it was necessary. There'll be people who would have pined for another year of Roy Hodgson, and towards the end of that tenure, there was a part of me that kind of thought, you know what, maybe we keep Roy Hodgson for another year. But the problem with that is that there wouldn't have been this kind of shake-up, and with so many players out of contract, I think you needed to make that change then in the summer than give them all another year and go on from there, or give some of them 2 or 3 years where perhaps that wouldn't have made sense. He certainly wouldn't have brought in so many younger players. They wouldn't have been able to completely transition the squad age and change the squad age. I haven't checked actually what the squad age is at the moment, but last season it was the oldest in the Premier League, and the year before it was the oldest in the Premier League, and it just wasn't sustainable. And to be honest with you, I think it was a bit disappointing for a club like Palace that, maybe this is kind of me being slightly biased, but I feel like Palace are a club that has always kind of prided itself on having young players coming through, and I don't think that was necessarily going to be the case under Hodgson. After Patrick Vieira's press conference against Chelsea after the defeat on the opening day, he talked about. He was asked what did he learn from his squad. He said he didn't learn anything because he already knew that they needed to to reinvest and to bring more players in. And I asked him about Jesurun Rak-Sakyi, who, released 2 years ago by Chelsea, picked up by Palace, had an okay first season. Nobody outside of the club would have said, this kid's one that would come through. I think you'd have to be on the inside of the club to know, to see him in training and to see the specifics that he does to know whether or not he was capable. But certainly last year he was absolutely outstanding. Certainly towards the end of the season, the sort of last 6 months, he was outstanding. And Vieira was very full of praise for him, but he also pointed to the fact that you've got four academy players on the bench, but they were there really just to make up the numbers, and they're not quite ready yet to step forward. And that was quite interesting, despite the fact they had been with the squad throughout pre-season. And I certainly wouldn't disagree with him. I'm someone who is very keen to see Palace bring young players through, but it is difficult with academy players because they do have to be at a level where they can contribute. And I think the problem that people sometimes have is that they sort of say, "Oh, are they ready?" I mean, what does ready mean? I mean, I know Patrick Vieira said it, and other people use that phrase, but I just don't really like the word ready. I mean, it doesn't really mean anything to me. For me, it's a case of, are they in a position where they can contribute? And at the moment, really, only Rak-Sakyi is the one that can do that. But in 2 or 3 years' time, I think there will be a handful of players who can do that. Obviously, they brought in younger players now as well. So you've got Marc Guéhi, Michael Olise, the 19-year-old from Reading. You've got Ebere Eze, I think he's 22, 23. Tyreek Mitchell at left back, I think again 22 or 22 this year. Joachim Andersen is I think 25. So he's, compared to last season where all of Palace's centre backs were over the age of 30, that's quite a considerable drop. So, it's been really interesting to see that change. And I think that was necessary for the club to go forward. You look at the players they've sold over the last few years, and I think other than Wan-Bissaka, their highest sale is probably Alexander Sørloth, and that was 22 million to Leipzig, but that was shared equally between Palace and Trabzonspor, so about 10 million each. And they actually kind of made a very slight loss / sort of kind of broke even roughly on him. So they needed to do it. The accounts are not in a great position, but that will change going forward because they'll end up progressing these players, the likes of Guéhi, the likes of Olise, and I think they will. The idea is that they can produce these players and then perhaps sell them on.
Yeah, I think what you're saying there is, you can essentially hit the nail on the head for why Crystal Palace kind of makes a very good Scouted Football Pod episode, because, what you're saying there about Hodgson and the players that were out of contract, it was kind of, sourcing that clean break at that time with so many players out of contract, a manager who was probably coming to, the end of his professional career. It seemed as though, certainly from my perspective, that it was perhaps the right time to maybe just go for that. Right, we have to just try something new here, and the squad age thing where Palace had the oldest team for 2 seasons running in the Premier League. I mean, this year certainly, maybe not based on that first starting 11 of the season, but in terms of probably the most used 11 throughout the course of this season, I doubt that will be the oldest by the end of the campaign. And that will be obviously reflective of a new manager in charge, and obviously most importantly them having new players in. And I suppose you mentioned there Jesurun Rak-Sakyi, and he's a player we'll get onto in a bit, but he's one I'm very much excited by because I was listening to Gary Isse speaking ahead of the under-23s opening game of the season the other evening, and he was saying Rak-Sakyi is a player who was he was pretty much undersized. Who, when he joined from Chelsea, wasn't really pulling up any trees. And since then, I mean, that last 6 months, as you say, broke from the under-18 Premier League into PL2 with the 23 side, and obviously he's gone on to make his debut. But just sort of starting, right back at the beginning, you mentioned Aaron Wan-Bissaka there, and obviously him being the club's biggest biggest sale, and by some margin. He is. I mean, if people were to think about Beckenham or any player at Crystal Palace who had come through in the past 5-10 years, I think the first person on many people's lips would be Aaron Wan-Bissaka. Was that under Roy Hodgson? Was that perhaps a one-off? Was it a case of where he? I mean, I've read loads about how he obviously was not a fullback, and it was just a case of him, being put in training, and the coaches were like, actually, he can. This boy can play here. Was that kind of a one-off because of the approach that Hodgson took, or he preferred to have more experienced players, or was it purely an accidental, injuries dictated that there was an opportunity there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one with Aaron Wan-Bissaka. I mean, it's difficult with Roy Hodgson because people will always kind of have their thoughts on him and say, oh, look, he's this, and I'm not saying this, but people might sort of, refer to him as someone who would only give youth a chance if he absolutely had to. I don't think that's the case. I think that with him, I think that the idea was that you had to know your position, you had to know the game, you had to know exactly what you were doing, because the way that Palace played under Roy Hodgson, and I suppose this was true of Roy Hodgson, maybe in the last sort of 10 to 12 years of his managerial career, possibly even longer. But I know that he was thought of as a very progressive coach when he was in Scandinavia. But, certainly in the Premier League, it's a bit different. And, it's very difficult for young players to break through into the Premier League. I think people underestimate just how difficult that is. And as I said to you already, I think that it's really important for clubs to focus on youth development and bring young players through. But I think with Aaron, it was a case of, yes, initially he was playing well for the under-18s, and he'd made that step up into the 23s. I think the one thing with Aaron at the start of his career, I suppose, if you like, is that he got away from some people that perhaps were a bit of a negative influence on him. Some of the players who got released around, I think it would have been scholarship age at Palace, at the same group as him. He was kind of in with them and they got released, and that kind of allowed him to realise that he needed to step forward and make that change himself. And then into the 23s, he went as a winger. Kevin Keane, who I think is now at West Ham, I think, if I'm right, he realised that he put Aaron as a right back. He said, look, let's just give him a go at right back. And he did really well. And Kevin Keane kind of continued to suggest that. And Richard Shaw, who was the under-23 manager at the time, now at Watford, went along with that and agreed with that. And then he started to carry on doing well, and then he sort of went into the first team set up, and he trained with the first team for quite some time. So it wasn't as if he just sort of quickly went into the first team, hadn't trained a lot with them, and then got a debut. It was very much a case of being with them for quite some time before he got his debut. I think was it a one-off? Partially, yes. I think you saw with Tyreek Mitchell as well coming through that Hodgson was prepared to give Mitchell an opportunity at left back. He did have to work really hard to do that, but my understanding is, and I wrote this in a piece before, I think it was after Tyreek Mitchell's first goal, that there's mutual respect. There was a lot of mutual respect between Mitchell and Hodgson that people may not have known. That he really is grateful for Hodgson for giving him an opportunity. I think Hodgson just demands high standards, and sometimes academy players don't always have those high standards and aren't able to have those high standards simply because they don't have the experience. And I think that it's really important to note that, yes, there are managers who are more willing to take risks. I think the main thing with Hodgson is that he was so risk averse in everything that he did. It was about minimising risk, whereas other managers aren't like that, and therefore they're more prepared to give young players a chance because they feel that is the benefit. And also you have to look at the context of Palace and the situation that they were in. the fact that they had gone on from that De Boer debacle, where Palace had spent quite a lot of money on players under Sam Allardyce, particularly in January, I think it would have been January 17. De Boer comes in the summer of 2017. Palace spend, I think, 26 to 30 million on Mamadou Sakho, a fantastic footballer, but just so injury prone in the end. And they're in the relegation zone with no points from 4 games. That continues till the 7th game. I think they win on the 8th game. And then Hodgson was there simply to keep Palace up, and he did what he thought was best for keeping Palace up. Patrick Vieira is not the new manager to keep Palace in the Premier League. Patrick Vieira is the manager to rebuild Crystal Palace Football Club into a more sustainable football club and push it on for the future. And that involves bringing young players through.
Yeah, and I think it's probably a good idea to get onto Vieira because he has a rich history of working with young players. I think everybody knows that he was most recently at Nice in Ligue 1, which is as I said on last week's podcast, the self-styled league of talents. It has a history of just bringing through young players, and Nice are no different. They work there with youngsters quite often, and have if it's not them bringing through players themselves, then they're taking young players from other French clubs, as they have done this summer, and from other leagues. But as well with Vieira, obviously he worked initially with Manchester City's youth teams, which then in turn got him the job at New York City FC in Major League Soccer over in the States. So throughout his managerial career, as sort of as brief as it has been, I don't know whether brief is the right word, because I think there's this perception that he might be inexperienced at a certain level, but he actually does have a fair bit of experience managing young players. And given the makeup of this Palace squad, does that then make him experienced because he has a penchant for working with younger footballers and maybe nurturing them a bit better? I don't know, but I think there is reason to be encouraged, even if at times at Nice the football wasn't exactly buccaneering or swashbuckling or the most entertaining style. You look at the players that have come in this summer. You look at those and you think, well, you have to imagine that Vieira has had some say in that. That these are the players, these are the type of players, the profiles that he wants to work with, especially the age profiles. But from your perspective, Matt, with Vieira, having seen sort of what has gone on in pre-season, having seen the messaging from the club, his press conferences, everything that's come out, the people who he's brought in, I can't remember who it is. Was it somebody who worked at Nice with him? I can't remember.
Wilson.
Yes, yeah. These types of characters who are who are going to be equally influential, because I think it often gets lost in the maelstrom of there is the players, the manager, the board. There's actually a huge skeleton staff.
Well, this is what's interesting, Joe, is that obviously under Roy Hodgson, it was Roy Hodgson, Ray Lewington, and then you had Dave Reddington as a first team coach, and that was that. And then it was the under 23s with Sean Derry and Stephen Rice, previously Richard Shaw as well, and and under Vieira, he's got, as we just said, Christian Wilson, who worked with him initially at New York, then went to Nice with him. Sorry, at Man City, then went to New York, then went to Nice with him. So he's a first-team coach. And he got Said Aigon, formerly of PSG, worked at PSG for 5 years in their youth team. He's an individual development coach, and what's fascinating is that he's there to basically bridge that gap between the under-23s and the first team. We hear a lot about B teams, and I've got to be honest with you, Joe, I get a bit frustrated by the obsession with B teams. I think and the criticisms levelled at under-23 football, there's no doubt in my mind that under-23 football is not perfect and that there are things that need to change. But a B team is not a huge... There's nothing stopping teams with under-23 teams from going and arranging those friendlies, for example. I understand the B team model, and it is great that they get these young players to sort of play alongside more senior players and go out and play these teams in friendlies, but there's nothing stopping under 23s or in addition to under 23s. I can't think who it was, but someone very recently, I think it's QPR, isn't it? The other day have just announced a B team where it's actually they're keeping their under 23 team, but they're having a B team as well. And for me, that's the best approach.
Yeah, it was QPR, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think so with Said Igon, it's kind of bridging that gap between 23s and first team, and now Vieira's got this backroom staff, and he's brought in Ocean Roberts, and people may not know a lot about Ocean Roberts. If you're not Welsh or focused on the Welsh national team, maybe you don't know a lot about him, but I've got a piece out. I'm not sure when the podcast's going out, but I imagine by the time it's out, then I've got a piece out on Ocean Roberts, and it's really interesting because he's worked with young players at Wales, and he was instrumental in the Wales way, the Welsh way of bringing through young players and making sure that they had the best development possible. That wasn't just formation. It was principle over formation, and that's something that Vieira is implementing at Palace. I've seen it already. He changed formation 3 times against Chelsea. He started with a 4-4-2, having played a 4-1-2-3, 4-3-3, however you want to describe it, but it was with 2 number 8s. And I think Palace are going to focus on principles of play, and that's going to filter down into the youth teams. I think Paddy McCarthy being moved up to under 23 manager is a really good decision by Palace. You've got 2 first team coaches in Christian Wilson and Sean Derry, so straight away you've got the same number of people that Roy Hodgson had, and then you've got Said Igon and you've got Ocean Roberts, both of whom have a lot of experience with young players. I spoke to Johnny Williams, who absolutely loves Palace still, and you hear it every time you speak to him. And he was saying how good Ocean Roberts was to him when he was the only Englishman at under 15s or under 14s in a cold, rainy autumn day in Newtown in Wales for his first game for Wales under 14s, and he spoke so highly of Roberts. So I think they've really, really invested in the staff. I think clearly that's something that Vieira's choice, that he's brought these people in. He knows these people. And bringing Sean Derry in also, I think, helps with that transition into the first team for the younger players, because he knows them already. He's been the under-23 manager, so he knows them already. So I think it's a really interesting way of doing it. I think Palace have done really well there. There's still obviously a lot of question marks over Vieira as a manager. That's inevitable. He hasn't managed in the Premier League before. There were criticism levelled at him at Nice, which I believe were because of his not obsession, but his desire to be principles over formation as such, which is probably why he was accused of lacking identity on the pitch. And that could well be a problem at Palace. We'll have to wait and see. But it's just really interesting, I think. And I think this is a really good appointment, in at least in respect of the young players at Palace and the young players they brought in.
Yeah, so sort of investing in the players and investing in the staff as well. I think it's one of those areas which is just as important. If you don't have the staff in place to mould those individual players into a team and to bridge those gaps between under 23 and first team, especially when you do have players who are in contention, to make that jump. If there's not the structure, the principles and the processes in place to be able to facilitate that, then I suppose it's a wasted endeavour on many sides. So smoothing out that process, as you say that Vieira has attempted to do, the club have attempted to do in the short period of time that the changing of the guard has taken place, then I think it bodes well. But obviously, the team will rise or fall with performances and results. So obviously the hope is that they obviously, it's not even 1 week of the season. Of course, you only hope they pick up after you've played Chelsea at Stamford Bridge, one of the hardest games of the season. But I think there's reason for optimism, certainly, as well as that cautious, the caution over Vieira himself. But the men that he's brought in, the characters, the people that are that are going to shape Crystal Palace over the next few years. That it's definitely encouraging. But onto sort of the playing side of things, and I think it's only right that we discuss the young players that have come into to Selhurst Park this season, or this summer rather, and. As we mentioned earlier, there's been Conor Gallagher's come in on a season-long loan. Michael Olise has come in from Reading after really lighting up the Championship with just fantastic technique. He's been an excellent player for them. Obviously, last year we saw the introduction of Ebere Eze to the Premier League, which was, I think, a long time coming, really. And then, of course, Marc Guéhi, and even the likes of Joachim Andersen, who, as you mentioned, is still only 24, 25, which is still, for a top-level centre-back, still quite young in the grand scheme of things. But I just want to talk about Gallagher and Olise to start with. There was interest from other clubs. I mean, I know myself there was interest from Leeds in Conor Gallagher. They wanted to. I mean, they famously gave their presentation to Gallagher of where he would fit into the team, where what his role would be, how influential he could be. But ultimately, the decision was Palace in the end, and Michael Olise. Obviously, there was the rumour before it became fact that there was that £8 million release clause in his Reading contract, and for that price, given how impressive he'd been over 1 1/4 seasons in the Championship, that's a very palatable price for pretty much every Premier League club. So for Palace to have got both of them for 2021-22 at least, obviously with Gallagher being on loan. How was it that the club managed to persuade those two, and rightly so, highly rated young English talents to come to Selhurst?
It's quite interesting with Gallagher because last summer he was very, very close to signing, and then Palace realised that they needed a striker, and who did they go for? They went for Michy Batshuayi. And of course, you can't sign two players on loan from the same club in the Premier League. So they opted for Batshuayi over Gallagher, which I suppose in your mind you might think, well, surely then that would put him off, but apparently not. I think with that, and with Olise as well, I think Olise, the one thing that I haven't touched on yet is that Patrick Vieira's sort of sway. This is a World Cup winner, like one of the best players the Premier League has ever seen. I think was he captain for France when they won the World Cup? I mean, he certainly captained France, didn't he? So
he was certainly influential in that team, wasn't he? It was him and Emmanuel Petit in the middle, wasn't it?
Yeah. So his reputation precedes him. And with Olise, I know that he spoke to Olise's mum, I think it was, in French, which I think was partly helpful. And I think that it's just one of those things where his reputation makes a difference, and I think that the way that Palace probably sold it as well probably would have helped, that we're building something new, we're going to play to your strengths, we're going to play a much more attacking style, we're going to give youth a chance, you've got a good opportunity here. And I imagine they probably said, look, if you go on and do really well and big teams come in for you and make big bids for you, then look, we've sold Aaron Wan-Bissaka to Manchester United, we're not going to stand in your way. I don't know for certain that they've said that, but I would not be surprised if they basically said it's okay kind of to use a cliche, to use this as a stepping stone to something bigger in future once you've helped us.
It's a good bargaining chip, isn't it? You can say, look what we did with Aaron Wan-Bissaka. Look what regular football can do for you here.
Absolutely, and I'm sure they would have pointed to Ebere Eze as well. I think I've got to give Roy Hodgson credit here, and a lot of people were very negative about this last season. I remember there was a press conference, it must have been relatively early in the season after Palace signed Eze. It must have been around September, October, probably October time, maybe November. And Hodgson said that he was working with Eze, and that Eze needed to do what Townsend and Schlupp had done Andros Townsend and Jeffrey Schlupp had done over the last 3 years, which was to make sure that they defended well, that they got back and they tracked back and they defended well. And people were up in arms about that because why would you do that to Ebere Eze? He's a really great attacking talent. Why would you shackle him in a defensive system, playing defensive football and force him to defend? And yet, come the end of the season, he had massively improved defensively. And then he got to sort of, I think there was a piece I wrote, I think it was, towards the end of the season, and Palace basically let him go and attack a lot more. And it worked really well, even within a defensive system. And I think what Hodgson did well with young players, with what Aaron Wan-Bissaka, with Tyreek Mitchell, and with Ebere Eze, is that he taught them a side of the game that maybe some other managers wouldn't have been able to, and that was that defensive nous. And I think now that Eze's got a manager in Vieira who's going to be more attacking, I think that defensive ability is going to really help him, and I think that's really important because now he can be more free to attack, but he's learnt that defensive side. So he's a more complete player. I think that's really important in the Premier League. And I think that's what perhaps makes the difference between the Championship and the Premier League, and also perhaps between a player who is really good at the bottom of the Premier League and someone who is really good in the middle, who could potentially go on to be at the top of the Premier League. So I think they might do that with Olise in a way. I think they might kind of have that idea of developing him into a more complete player. I mean, there's obviously sort of some things around him that, maybe there were some problems at Manchester City and at Chelsea when he was younger, which is why he didn't end up staying there. But I think those are things that Palace must be confident they can iron out.
Yeah, no, I get where you're coming from. And just on Ebere Eze, obviously sustained an Achilles injury. Was it towards the back end of last year, or rather last season, sort of throughout the summer. When can we sort of expect him to be back on the pitch? Because I've seen a few training pictures. I've seen him in sort of the new kits and stuff in the promo images. But I suppose the $1 million question is when are we going to be seeing Ebere Eze back from what is a pretty nasty injury for a player of his style?
Yeah, so it was obviously really, really disappointing and gutting that, first of all, Ebere Eze ruptured his Achilles, and then a day later, Nathan Ferguson did exactly the same thing. Well, not exactly the same thing, but suffered an Achilles injury himself, having, just come back from a long-term knee problem that has prevented him from making his Palace debut, after Palace were really cautious as well in easing him back in. But yeah, I think Eze is well ahead of schedule, is my understanding. Likewise, Olise is ahead of schedule from a back injury. Patrick Vieira said of Olise that he'll be back, he's aiming to be back on the training pitch in the next couple of weeks. So I would expect maybe this time next month we might well see an Olise debut. As for Eze, I would expect that to be around sort of November time is my understanding, that they're expecting him to be back in the team, ready to play games by November, maybe soon, maybe slightly sooner than that. And that's obviously well ahead of the initial prognosis, which was sort of around the turn of the new year. And then obviously you've got to talk about getting back to fitness and things like that. But I was sort of seeing that I think even Benteke had a similar injury a year or so ago, and it took him about 5 or 6 months. So I think the way that sports science and that has come on in physiotherapy is that they're in a better position to get them back quicker from these injuries. I just think, I know Palace will do this, I'm sure they will, but you just got to be a little bit careful, because someone like that, you don't want him to get another injury too soon by rushing him back. Even if you do need him, I think it's better to be slightly cautious.
Yeah, protecting the player sort of over because obviously you only get one career at the end of the day, and two sort of exploding Achilles injuries would be devastating to any of his his long-term potential. But I think this is no longer sort of the day and age of, oh well, just shake it off and play on, that sort of thing. I mean, obviously, as you say there, the scientific side of things definitely prioritizes the long-term well-being of players and stuff. So it's great to hear, personally from my perspective, absolutely fantastic to hear that November could be the time that we see him back on the pitch, and equally good that he and Olise are ahead of ahead of schedule. But on sort of another addition that was made in the summer, that was obviously the central defender Marc Guéhi from Chelsea. Obviously knows Conor Gallagher very, very well, having joined Chelsea at the same time when they were around 9 years old or something, or 7 or 8 years old, something like that. When around 15 years ago it will have been now, or thereabouts. But I mean, you bring in two central defenders who are, on paper, probably the two strongest central defenders, or two of the strongest central defenders at the club, in Guéhi and Joachim Andersen. I suppose the assumption is that those two will look to partner each other in future. Perhaps, obviously, that hasn't come to fruition yet because of the times that they were signed and whatnot. But on Guéhi, I've got one question really that has been sort of in the back of my mind throughout the whole summer, and it's that I feel like with Palace's position in the league, as a mid-table team, and also within their position in the country, being in South London, but being very much in close proximity to some of the Europe's best academies we're talking about here. Is there? I mean, this is probably something which isn't exactly going to be put out by the club, but would you say that the recent business that they've done, with even with the likes of Jesurun Rak-Sakyi, bringing him in from Chelsea, after not bringing him in, but picking him up after he was let go, even with Ebere Eze, the fact that he was let go by Arsenal, Millwall, and obviously QPR ended up picking him up. But do you think that with pivoting towards sort of I don't know what the best term to describe this is, but picking up players that are in the London diaspora that have perhaps fallen by the wayside at other clubs that clearly have immense talent but need a platform and need an opportunity to show it. Is that something which you think that Palace could really tap into? Because from my perspective, I thought, is there a better Premier League? And there's no doubt in my mind after watching Guéhi for Swansea last year, there's no doubt that a Premier League club should come in for him. But is there a better club at the moment than Crystal Palace for him? I didn't think so. Obviously, that move then ended up happening. I felt incredibly validated. I should have expressed that on the timeline or something, shouldn't I? But I just thought that the Palace have a unique position, both geographically and sort of figuratively speaking, that they can offer these platforms to these players at this period of time.
I actually think it's the complete opposite.
Really?
Not that that they don't want to do that or they don't have an opportunity, but I think it is that they don't want to do that, which is why they've just spent so much money on their academy. So I think the whole point of this summer and bringing someone like Marc Guéhi and last summer bringing Ebere Eze, it's kind of a twofold thing. It's we want to get the best of the Championship, and that's something that I think Sporting Director Dougie Freedman was keen to do, was to go out and get the best players from the Championship, the best young players, I should add, from the Championship, and bring them in and nurture them and improve them. So I think that was the first part of it. But then, obviously you have to balance it and you have to bring in players who are good enough and who have the experience. And that's what they've done with Marc Guéhi, is they brought someone in who's been excellent for Swansea, who can play the way that they want to play under Patrick Vieira, and who's quite flexible at the back as well in relative terms. Likewise, Joachim Andersen can play in a back three. I think we'll see that more from Palace this season than I originally did in pre-season, after hearing Vieira's comments that I alluded to earlier about principles over formation and the fact that he changed formation. So there's that side of it, that they do want to bring these players in, and they will always continue to pick up players from the academies of Chelsea and Arsenal, I suppose, and Spurs. The other player that we haven't mentioned, who will know Marc Guéhi and Conor Gallagher well, is Nia Kirby in Palace's under-23s. He won the under-17 World Cup with the pair. He was in that squad. That just kind of goes to show how youth development is so unpredictable that 1 minute you can be winning the under-17 World Cup with England, and a few years later you're still in the under-23s, whilst two of your colleagues have played 40 odd games, maybe more, professionally. But Palace's academy, what they want to do, the whole point of their regeneration of their academy, the rebuild of the academy, the 20 million investment. They've gone from playing on pitches which had potholes in when I first went to see them in like 2014 at what was then Goals in Beckenham. It was a good site in the sense that it was close to their training ground. It was big enough, but they didn't own it, so they couldn't really invest too much money in it. As the years went on, they did that, and that was good, but it wasn't a place that they owned, so they didn't want to put too much money in. And then they spent 20 million after, in terms of, first of all, buying the land on a long-term lease. I think it's 75 years, and subsequently redeveloping it. But what they want to do is they want to make the most of the area and the opportunities to bring in the players. So, there's players they've lost to Chelsea, like one, for example, Nathan Young-Coombs, now at Brentford B, or Brentford, kind of bit of both. Fire Rangers. He's just one example. There's plenty of others. Most really, they mostly go at a younger age before anyone really knows about them. The whole point is that they get these players before the likes of Chelsea. They can say to these kids, look, we've got these fantastic facilities. What we've got a benefit over Chelsea is that we've got a pathway through to the first team. And again, that's kind of the fact that they got rid of 10 players in the summer because they wanted to have an opportunity, an opening for these young players to come through if they're good enough, the key being if they're good enough. And the under-18s this season, the second-year scholars in particular, who came second in the under-18 Premier League, are certainly considered to be one of the best groups that this club has ever produced. Most of them have been here for a long time. They won the under-15 Floodlit Cup. So I think the whole point is that they bring through their own players because that saves them so much money. As we said earlier, Wan-Bissaka, 50 million plus however many millions of pounds he probably saved in wages from having to sign another right back. Tyreek Mitchell, Palace haven't got the money to sign a left back this summer, so he's saving them a lot of money. So it's just a case of making the most of what is on their doorstep that they couldn't do before. So I'm sure it is to some extent still going to be, we're going to pick up players from other clubs because that's what they do. They just look for the best. Whereas now, whilst they can do that, they can do that in addition to focusing on their own talent and bringing their own talent through from a young age. So don't think they really want to be signing Marc Guéhi. What they want to be doing is they want to be signing Marc Guéhi at the age of 8, at the age of 10, instead of the age of, what is he, 21, I think?
Yeah, I know what you mean, as in you want to be producing your own Marc Guéhi rather than
exactly
signing Chelsea's Marc Guéhi for 21 million. Yeah. I see where you're coming from. Obviously, it makes sense. It makes financial sense, doesn't it? I think a hybrid approach is probably what a lot of mid-table Premier League clubs who've maybe got a bit more focus on their under-23s are looking at doing. And Palace are one of those clubs that can do that. I suppose looking towards the academy then and the next generation, we discussed Jesurun Rak-Sakyi earlier on in the pod, and he's kind of the headline under-23 player that I would like to discuss on this pod because, I watched him a few times last season, and he did seem as though he was streets ahead of the under-18 level that he was playing at, which obviously then gave way to him appearing for the 23s and him obviously then making his senior debut, his league debut, correct me if I'm wrong with that senior debut bit, against Chelsea at the weekend. And then there was even the game against Leeds, which they lost 3-1 at Selhurst on Monday, which was obviously the start of the PL2 season for them. And Rak-Sakyi just, for anybody who regularly watches under-23 football or PL2 or anything like that, there is just that little bit extra that you can see in a player who is either has had first team experience or is first team ready, to use a terrible phrase. Um, there's just something about having that added that added X factor about Rak-Sakyi. And I
Yeah.
just wanted to know from your perspective. Obviously, you'll have seen quite a lot of him coming through in the past 2 years, and what he's like, what he's all about, and whether it's. I mean, it doesn't seem as though it's a surprise from a Palace perspective that he is making these inroads. Because I've got in my notes here, has he leapfrogged to the front of the under-23 queue by force or by circumstance? And I feel like I've got a good enough idea of which one it is.
It's interesting, yeah. With him, I mean, regrettably, I haven't been able to see too much of him in person because of COVID. He wasn't really hugely involved in his first year as a scholar, as I said earlier, which is, all the more remarkable how quickly he's gone from being that, first year scholar who was starting the odd game, maybe every other game he was starting, playing 50 minutes, and he scored, I think, 3 or 4 goals in the entire season, whereas he did that in like 2 games last season. It's really has been fascinating to see just how quickly he's risen. And I think Gary Izzet spoke to, I think it was the South London Press, about him, and I suppose more about how he came through and how he was produced and things like that. And he talked, as you said earlier, about the size and how he wasn't physically developed in that first year, and how over the summer he had this kind of massive growth spurt, and suddenly he was dominating teams because he was now physically capable at that level. There was never any question, I don't think, after he came in, of him being technically good enough. He was always considered to be technically good enough. He just wasn't physically there. And then in the second year, he just sort of shot up, and he's very direct. Like, it's inevitable that there's been comparisons with Wilfried Zaha. I don't think they're quite the same player. I think not to suggest that Rak-Sakyi isn't skillful, but I consider him to be more direct, and actually probably his finishing is probably better at that age than Wilfried Zaha's was. Wilfried Zaha was, the other comparison obviously to make is that Wilfried Zaha was kept out of the Palace under-18 team until his career changed in the FA Youth Cup against Newcastle. Sorry to say that. And
Oh, don't worry, you get used to it, I promise.
I actually think it was a 4-2 defeat, and he scored one and he won the penalty for another one at St James's Park. I remember speaking, I think it was Paul Dummett. Was it Paul Dummett? I can't think who it was now. I spoke to one of the Newcastle defenders that day for a piece on him that I wrote about. I think it was his early years, or it was 10 years of Wilfried Zaha. But basically, he was kept out of the team, and Rak-Sakyi was kept out of the team as well. And Palace didn't really have wingers in the under-18s when Rak-Sakyi was a first year. They kind of played almost with, I think it was Finn Mooney, who I really like, was playing on out wide for quite a while, and they had Jaden Raymond when he wasn't unfortunately injured as well, and Jack Wells-Morrison, I think, also another one I really rate, was kind of filling in there as well. So they didn't really play with wingers, and then when he was doing really well, they kind of switched to play that way. I think he can almost, I wouldn't put him up front, but you can see that he could kind of play in that kind of role in a weird way, I suppose. I suppose with a lot of wingers, that is the case. They can kind of, if you need them to, play as auxiliary strikers, which is unfortunately what we had to endure with Andros Townsend and Zaha for some time under Hodgson, and that didn't go very well. But with Rak-Sakyi, he's so direct and he's quick, and he's got this skill to take on a player without necessarily doing a box of tricks. And that's what I think kind of stands him out from other players, is that he doesn't necessarily do all these step overs. He just goes past these players. And I really enjoy that in him. I haven't seen as much as I would have liked of him. I'd really like to see him in person again. And I wasn't able to get to the under-23 game, but I will obviously be doing that this season as much as possible. But To be honest with you, I think he will be a feature in the first team, even if they do add players. I think they're looking at bringing in another winger on the right, which is obviously where he plays primarily, because it would be a lot of burden to have just him and Jordan Ayew in that team. So I think you do need one, but I do think that out of the lot, they do clearly see him as someone who does have the potential to influence a game, not necessarily right now, but maybe in 6 months' time. I think you'll be seeing him, if he continues this impressive form, you'll be seeing him on the bench for Palace's first team. The one word of caution, and this is only because he's young and inexperienced, is that I don't know if anyone listening would have watched Palace's under 23 playoffs at the end of last season, but he was quite quiet in those games. And I think even over the summer, as you mentioned, he played very well against Leeds and in the opening Premier League 2 game. And you saw a difference in him even over the summer. But I think, you just got to kind of remember that these are young players. They're going to be, their form isn't going to be permanently good. You're going to have to be patient with them. I think social media is great in that, it's great that people can be aware of these players more and, be positive about them. But equally, I think, clubs have so long spent so much time and effort trying to make sure that expectations aren't too high. I think they do need to be allowed to develop at their own pace. So I think it's just that case of managing expectations with him.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's something that we always say on this podcast is that especially the players towards the younger end of the spectrum, the ones who break through when they're 17, 18 years old, like Rak-Sakyi, who are, still very much in the infancy of their professional career and very much in the infancy of their, being this size and being their, at their fullest ability. They're still learning their frame, they're still learning their craft in a certain position. But I think there's a lot of value in being a player who can be direct and can beat players without having to rely on a box of tricks, as you said. And I think we hear that all the time in terms of players who go through growth spurts and then they are capable of doing the things that they wanted to do but previously physically couldn't. And I think that's a good way of sort of summing up the rise that Rak-Sakyi has had. The intelligence, the technical quality has been there, but it was rather a question of whether that growth spurt would come, and obviously it has to his benefit. But Matt, thank you very much for joining me on the Scouted Football podcast. I think your insight on Palace is absolutely unrivaled, as proven by the Palace Youth account and the FYP fanzine, and obviously, of course, writing for the Athletic. I think it's an exciting time. It's one of intrigue, certainly for me as a neutral, to see how this regeneration, I think is the word you used, to see how the regeneration takes place and transpires. But yeah, thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks very much, Joe.
That's all from us on the Scouted Football podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you like more of this, please do check out sfhandbook.com to get your hands on a copy of the Scouted Football Handbook collection. Currently, we have all of them on sale, but don't think that will be for very long, so get in while you can. We're going to be releasing a new handbook, hopefully in the next few weeks, next month at the latest. That will be number 12. If you like the stuff that we do over at Scouted Football, then please consider supporting us. But yeah, this has been the Scouted Football podcast, Crystal Palace's Regeneration with Matt Woosnam. I've been Joe Donoghue. Thank you very much. Bye for now.